energy and financial reporter at the Washington Post. I'd like to introduce my guest today, Kevin McIntyre, the chairman of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Before we get started, I want to remind our audience here in the room and those watching online that you can tweet questions for Chairman McIntyre using hashtag 202Live, and I'll pose a few of those questions later on in our discussion. Well, welcome here to the Washington Post Live.
Thank you, Steve. Great to be here with you.
Usually, you wouldn't juxtapose the phrase lively time and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, but it's been a pretty lively time, I think, for you already. And I thought we'd start by talking about one of the more controversial things, the Energy Department's initial effort to try to get the FERC to approve increased compensation for coal and nuclear plants in the name of resilience and reliability. And so I'd like to hear you talk a little bit more about that, but also, as you know, you've sort of left the door ajar a bit by saying, well, let's take a look at this issue of resilience. So I thought we could start by talking a bit about what you mean by this holistic approach and what is resilience, and is there any connection between resilience and the issue of cost and competition?
Okay, sure. Yeah, let's cover a few of those bases. First, yes, at the time I arrived at the FERC, I was sworn in on December 7th. Yes, my first day, a date which will live in infamy. At that time, already pending before the FERC and thus awaiting my attention, was this notice of proposed rulemaking that had been sent to the FERC by the Secretary of Energy under rarely used authority under Section 403 of the Department of Energy Organization Act. The fact that it was rarely used doesn't, in my view, particularly as a lawyer, make it any less valid. It was validly proffered to us for our consideration, and yes, as you have said, it was premised on the idea of the security of our bulk power system, the resilience of our bulk power system. And although under the legal standards that apply to the FERC's processing of such a proposal, we were unable to accept it in the form that it was given to us, and our actions, our official action on it, reflected that view. All 5 of us commissioners at the FERC voted that we could not accept it in its form, but we did acknowledge and in fact embrace the concept of resilience as something that really does cry out for attention. And so we initiated our own proceeding to address that, and that proceeding is underway now. We have invited comment from all of industry and other stakeholders as to whether there are attributes to resilience that we should recognize among different types of electric resources, and if so, what should be the treatment of those resources for purposes of providing compensation to them.
Well, and I mean, how do you think that what are the key attributes you think that would go along with resilience, and does that have something to do with what you pay for the power generated by those facilities?
Well, we're trying to figure that out now, but certainly in my view as a conceptual matter, we're not doing it right if we don't recognize what the attributes are, define them sufficiently to justify action upon them, and ensure that we get the compensational aspect of it right. And this is not unique to resilience attributes. We already have certain types of functions that are performed by different types of electric generating resources in different ways. For example, providing voltage support to our transmission grid, providing frequency response. I mean, these are highly technical concepts, but certain types of electric generating facilities are recognized as being able to provide these types of supportive measures. We call them ancillary services. The services that are not pure transmission and are not pure generation in the customary sense, but do help to keep our grid functioning well. And those attributes are recognized in official FERC policy and are compensated accordingly. So it wouldn't be beyond the pale to think that if we could identify with sufficient specificity what are the resilience attributes that merit compensation, then we can move to that compensation calculation stage.
But they wouldn't necessarily be, say, 90 days fuel supply on
They would not necessarily be, that's right. Now
because I think a lot of people, especially people who are skeptical about the future of coal plants, think that this is sort of a a solution in terms in search of a problem, and I was wondering whether you share that view.
I wouldn't describe it as a solution in search of a problem. I do think that the spate of extreme weather events we've had over the past several years have given us a lot of data and ability to study exactly how our grid performed, with a particular eye towards seeing whether there are certain types of generating resources that did better than others, that were more reliable than others during those very challenging operational circumstances. So we are going through that now. This is started with the polar vortex a couple of years ago, and then the more recent so-called bomb cyclone weather events of 2017 into 2018.
So, now First Energy has come back, and the Department of Energy has come back trying to invoke the idea that there's an emergency that involves, perhaps above all, First Energy's nuclear and coal plants, but perhaps a bit more broadly, or perhaps not. But maybe you could talk a bit about whether you think we have an emergency on our hands or not.
I don't think we have an emergency on our hands right now in the sense of the ability of our grid to perform today and in coming weeks and months. I don't think we have that sort of situation. However, that's not my call. Section 202C of the Federal Power Act, which was the basis on which First Energy has made its submittal to the Department of Energy, has its own standards spelled out there, and I trust the Secretary of Energy and his team at DOE to kind of perform their own valid analysis of that and to determine whether or not any further action is necessary.
I mean, it does seem like an odd thing to invoke. I mean, these are old statutes that were created in a different context. One of them, to use for Truman to use against the steel industry, just doesn't seem like this is that kind of comparable situation.
Yes, it's perhaps not the most obvious fit. Even Section 202C of the Federal Power Act tees off of the concept of continuance of a war in which the United States is involved as being kind of the baseline circumstance that would justify a DOE order to certain types of facilities to either begin operating or continue operations. The statute does go on to encompass, in a more generic fashion, some sort of ongoing emergency of similar import. So I agree with the suggestion of your question that the fit is perhaps not the most obvious one, but I'm certain that DOE has a handle on that issue and will analyze that in making its decision.
So there's another request from an ISO in New England about keeping some facilities open in order to bolster the economic health of an LNG import facility. Does that seem like a more reasonable request, and how do you view that?
I don't know. As you know, I am but one of 5 voices / votes on the commission. I don't like to get ahead of my colleagues on matters such as that. So I won't hit that one directly. But I think that considerations like that are completely valid.
I wanted to also ask you a bit about FERC's relationship with the states. I don't need to tell you, you're part of a patchwork of organizations and agencies that deal with the electric grid and gas pipelines. So I was wondering how you see your priorities fitting together with those of the states, especially in areas where we have renewable portfolio standards that are envisioning much higher level of renewables, for example. How does that all fit together with your goals, and is there some sort of conflict there that you might have to resolve at some point?
There is an inherent tension. I wouldn't say it rises to the level of a conflict, but there's an inherent tension there between the state roles and the federal role. Let's face it, we have a federal system of law and government. We at FERC have our statutorily spelled out role, and the states have somewhat broad license to make their own policy decisions about what sorts of resource mixes they prefer for the satisfaction of energy needs within their respective footprints. And we at FERC must take whatever power comes onto the grid, and our role is kind of the economic insurer of justness and reasonableness of rates and terms and conditions of service. So a given state may say we want X percent of the electric generation in this state to come from renewable resources. That power is generated, does make its way onto the grid, whose markets we regulate, and our obligation is to ensure that all of that takes place under terms and conditions that are just and reasonable and not unduly discriminatory. The tension comes in where someone can look at the resource mix that comes out of a given state or group of states or region and say, well, doesn't this amount to a thumb on the scale in favor of this type of resources and against that type of resource? And the question is not a crazy one. And it's one that we have to make some policy sense out of, hence the tension.
Right. I mean, to what extent do you feel that some innovations, both in renewable energy and as well as in storage, may be changing the nature of this calculation?
They unquestionably are changing it. I personally view that as a good thing. I think all of the various technological advancements that we have seen in the last couple of decades have been nothing but helpful to our electricity sector, our energy sector in general. Every public official in America says, in answer to the question, how should we satisfy our nation's energy needs? All of the above. And I don't think you can really legitimately be an all of the above person unless you recognize the roles of all of these various types of not only pure electric generating resources, but some of the technology that has advanced even without being pure generation. You referenced storage, that's increasingly important. Demand response, the agreement in advance to reduce consumption of electricity under certain operational circumstances, and other such steps.
Storage must be increasingly part of that whole picture. Do you have a vision as to what the grid is going to look like, say 10 or 15 years from now? I remember some years ago hearing John Wellinghoff, paint his vision of, cars that would be part of the storage for the grid. And we face a situation where perhaps more and more cars will be plugging in to the grid. So how do you see your ability to accommodate all those things going down the road a bit?
There's no question in my mind that storage will become increasingly a part of our grid and the reality of the operation of our grid. And God bless the electrical engineers who have to keep it all functioning because it's changing in real time. Mm-hmm. And much of it involves power that's being put onto our grid at the distribution voltage level, that is to say the lower voltage levels, not the big spine of interstate transmission that we think of when we even use the term grid. And so all of that has to be accommodated operationally in addition to policy-wise. It's going on right now. It's a good thing in my view. We recently took action at the FERC to direct the operators of our nation's wholesale electricity markets to remove any undue barriers that they can identify to the full participation in our energy markets of storage resources. In other words, to treat storage as if it were what we call bulk power transactions, the same as a sale of a chunk of wholesale power from one entity to another or into an organized market. So the ball is currently in the court of the operators of the nation's wholesale energy markets to come back to us and tell us exactly how they're going to do that, to really open the door wider for storage as a valid resource that may participate in our markets.
Do you think it's a legitimate goal for those who want to decarbonize the grid and to make it a greener thing? And that would, of course, be the whole idea of having electric cars. There's not as much point if there isn't a greener grid.
Well, that's FERC itself is not an environmental regulatory agency, so that's not really a matter for our decision. It certainly is something we're seeing in state decision making, and as I've noted, that's something we must accommodate in our own FERC role.
So I also want to ask you a bit about cybersecurity. There have been warnings about Russian campaigns to insert malware onto the energy infrastructure, and I was wondering whether what you've seen in this area and what sort of strategy you might have for combating that kind of intrusion.
Well, I think in your prior segment, Senators Hoeven and Heinrich did a real nice job of laying out some of the basic concepts on this topic. And I agree with something that was said by Senator Heinrich, that the day is not going to come when we may declare victory, at least in our lifetimes, over cyber problems. It is a matter that commands constant vigilance. We at FERC are constantly vigilant on the matter. We are in increasingly close coordination with other federal governmental counterparts, including, most importantly, the Department of Energy itself. And we monitor this stuff all the time because the threats are real and involve highly sophisticated players, state actors, and other entities that mean us harm as a nation, as an economy, mean to harm our national security, and mean to harm our populace. So we have to pay constant attention to it. In 2005, Congress gave to the FERC oversight over our nation's reliability, electric reliability, and empowered us to identify an organization that would be in charge of promulgating regulations for the assurance of reliability. That organization is the North American Electric Reliability Council, or NERC. And today, we have a robust and widespread system of reliability standards in place that include within their scope cyber protection. So this is something that gives us an official function in monitoring and asking ourselves constantly whether that suite of regulations, reliability standards, is doing what it's intended to do in terms of the protection of our grid from a cyber standpoint.
I mean, do you see a conflict between these defensive measures and the openness and accessibility of the grid? Because it seems as though the increasing number of ways you can connect with the grid could potentially all offer areas of vulnerability.
That is a real concern. In fact, we talk about a lot of technological advancements in energy leading to what we often hear referred to as the smart grid. It's possible that in certain respects our smart grid is a little too smart and thus a little too electronically accessible. There might be certain areas where we need to dumb down our grid a little bit for cyber protection reasons.
I also wanted to ask you about pipelines a bit, because that also falls in your bailiwick, and particularly wanted to ask about your attitude toward efforts to obstruct some pipelines, but also about some of the efforts to build them. Particularly interested in the conflict in Ohio at the moment with the Rover pipeline. Energy Transfer Partners has had a lot of accidents, I guess you could say, in Ohio, and the Ohio EPA has actually tried to block the completion of the pipeline in order to address some of these issues. And FERC has come in, I believe, and helped push it forward. Maybe you could comment about that conflict in particular.
Sure. Well, where there are matters that are pending before us pertaining to a particular company or project, I refrain from comment. However, I will say as a general matter that what we do when we have such matters before us, which is to say a matter that is awaiting an official FERC approval for infrastructure, whether it be natural gas pipeline or a hydroelectric project or otherwise, our Office of Energy Projects works very, very closely with the developer at ensuring that the developer is taking all appropriate steps to safeguard the environment and to adhere to best practices in the construction and siting and so on. So that process is well underway. And on the overall category of infrastructure, I would say that one of the things I committed to in taking this job was to looking for ways to streamline the process of approving, or if the circumstances call for it, declining to approve a particular project. Try to streamline that, eliminate any undue delays in our processing of the applications, and to enhance transparency and predictability of the process. So I'm hoping that we will continue to make progress in that regard.
I guess just to stick with this for another moment, the reason why this one sort of jumped out at me as opposed to all the many pipelines is that there was a FERC agreement with FERC that specifically barred the destruction of certain historic sites, which was done, and there have been quite a lot of spilling of drilling mud in the construction of the line that Ohio EPA said was, extremely unusual.
Well, here too, we see the interplay between federal and state roles. Another instance I would point to is efforts to build pipelines to New England, where you won't find a person in industry who can say that New England doesn't need new natural gas pipeline capacity. And yet, because of the state role in approving Clean Water Act approvals and granting Clean Water Act approvals, or as the case may be in New York
especially,
declining to grant Clean Water Act approvals, we have a situation that has emerged that amounts to the exercise of a veto power over federally administered projects. And is that appropriate? Who can say? I mean, these are valid questions, but we're just trying to do our utmost to, as I say, kind of streamline and be efficient in our own role.
So how do you deal with the situation in New York if you think it's extremely important to get a pipeline up to New England?
Any real change in that area would require action by Congress, because we at FERC are the lead agency for these approvals. Mm-hmm. That goes only so far.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. Well, maybe we want to, I know. So LNG plants.
Yes.
This is another area where you're involved in approvals. I've heard, oddly enough, some people criticize FERC, the current FERC, as opposed to the Obama FERC, for possibly being even slower in giving approvals for some LNG export facilities. What's happening in that area now?
There's a couple of things going on. First, in LNG, the federal government approvals involved are basically bifurcated between FERC and the Department of Energy. DOE approves the actual export of the energy commodity, liquefied natural gas, and FERC is in charge of giving thumbs up or thumbs down on the proposed facility, the LNG terminal that would be involved in the export. As to a comparison between where we at FERC are now versus the prior presidential administration, it's largely a matter of the numbers. There are today a lot more proposals before us awaiting our action than was the case some years ago during the kind of the core of the Obama administration. I think it was roughly a half dozen or so that were being processed for approval or not approval. And now, right now, I think we have something like 15 or 16 awaiting our action. So that presents a large workload for our Office of Energy Projects staff. They're doing a great job of working through it, working very closely with the project sponsors. Generally speaking, the project sponsors are very responsive to the need for information and analysis. So these are highly complex, resource-intensive projects, and so to determine whether or not to approve them is not a simple overnight process.
And is there a point where you think that there would be too many of these facilities given the resource here and the demand for natural gas here in the States?
Not necessarily, particularly if we move as we appear to be doing, ever more toward a global market for LNG. Mm-hmm. And we have this enormous resource of natural gas occasioned by the revolution in shale production. And so it's just natural market forces would suggest that production is going to seek out a market. And given the inherent limitations on the domestic market for consumption of natural gas, which in and of itself is a robust market, but the global market for LNG, I think, is just significantly larger in magnitude, and so it would not, I don't naturally find myself thinking that there's a limit on the number of LNG facilities or LNG export capacity that would be an issue for us.
I wanted to come back to the states for a minute because partly of what's happening, I think, during this administration is that some states are going their own way a little bit in terms of electricity policy, whether it's asking for homes to put solar in California or setting certain statewide targets. And then, of course, some of these states are all joining together with California. Do you see some sort of other regional transmission organization basically taking shape for decision-making purposes and a lot of areas that overlap with what FERC does?
For purposes of electric transmission projects, you mean?
Transmission, but also the type of
the resource mix?
Resource mix, exactly.
Well, over half of U.S. states and the District of Columbia already have renewable portfolio standards that spell out those jurisdictions' preferences and indeed mandates for what the resource mix should look like. I don't see that changing anytime soon. I think they are, as you suggest, getting more ambitious with regard to their goals. And so I believe that trend will continue. Yes, that does increase the tension I referenced earlier with our need at FERC to ensure that the markets operate in a way that's just and reasonable and not unduly discriminatory. But I think the trend is established and will continue.
And just to also go back a bit to the first question, I mean, I think one of the things that struck people at the decision that FERC took in January was the independence, or at that time of a commission that four of whose members were appointed by the president. I was wondering if you could just talk a bit about how you think of that and whether or not you feel under any pressure to accommodate some of the goals of this administration.
I don't feel under any pressure, and certainly no one has taken steps to try to pressure me. I do believe strongly in the independence of the FERC. FERC is an independent agency by statutory design and by proud tradition. And as long as I'm there, that will continue.
Okay, well, I think this has been helpful. Appreciate your coming here today. If there's anyone has any questions right here, we could do that. Otherwise, I'll say thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Muffs. Enjoyed it very much.
Okay.
Thank you.